So, philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
Well, David, last week we talked about free will,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a concept that came up when we were discussing it, and it's how your free will and your ability to choose whether or not you do something affords you the responsibility of that action, right? So, as a natural extension, I feel like this week we need to talk a little bit about responsibilities in general.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. So, I think we should begin, as we do with all things, with some strict definitions, and then we will work from there. So, from the Oxford, responsibility, the mass noun, is the state or fact of having a duty to deal with something or having control over someone. And the second definition is the state of fact of being accountable or to blame for something. And then there's a third one, which is the opportunity or ability to act independently and take decisions without authorization. And I think that last one really kind of speaks more to the type of responsibility we're talking about today. Maybe not exclusively, but I think it's hitting it more on the nose.
That one along with the first one, I think.
Yeah. When you start talking about responsibilities, I feel like there are a couple things that responsibilities always get roped in with, namely rights. For instance, someone says, "Oh, you have these rights and these responsibilities." However, while doing some research on this, I found that a lot of people don't really know what they mean when they say that. Some people will say, "You have the right to vote," for instance. Therefore, you are responsible for being a good voter. But even then, that's implying a standard. What does it mean to be a good voter? And it quickly devolves, the responsibilities attached to rights quickly start devolving down into expectations that one group or individual might have, which could differ well from another. So what I want to talk about today is the concept of responsibilities as they are derived from the first principles, which is a concept often spoken about in libertarianism. Because the bringing up an argument from first principles is just a purely axiomatic extension of why something is correct or incorrect or true or false. The first principles I really want to draw from are, they all kind of go back to property, the concept of property and ownership. And you can feel free to fill me in here. I'm going to kind of play this fast and loose. I think we'll talk about the first principles in their own episode at some point, but just to give a brief talk, the core axiom is things can be owned, or property exists, and things can be ascribed an owner.
Right. So by one way or another, individuals can come into ownership of
pretty much anything.
Right.
The second axiom is that you own yourself. That any individual or agent automatically owns themselves and any extension of themselves. Meaning your physical body and all of your thoughts and everything like that are yours and yours alone. No one can give them to you in a way. They're just owned by you. So when you start with this, it's you really begin talking about, these all make sense, right? None of these concepts are, I think, too far-fetched. You own yourself, which means you get to decide what you do with you and how you do you and all that stuff. And that's how free will kind of works there. And I feel like that's why most people under the assumptions of free will are kind of okay with it and understanding. Then there's when it comes to responsibilities, however, when it's coupled with rights, you are responsible for the things you own. This is the next natural, logical conclusion. If I own an animal and the animal kills someone, like I own a dog and it viciously attacks someone or kills someone even, because it was my property, I am responsible, not the dog, or because the dog's not an agent in that way.
Right. If you want to cast blame on the dog, that's your own business, but quote-unquote, society holds you responsible.
Exactly. And this is not always to be taken in a negative light. If I own a business and that business earns a profit, I am responsible for that profit, which means it becomes my property. In a way, when you talk about taking responsibility, you're really taking ownership of something in the same sense as you owning a physical item. You can own the metaphysical responsibility just as much as you own the physical, brick and mortar. And so that's kind of where we're going with that. Now, do you have anything to add to that? I don't want to jump off on another thing.
No, I think that's a fair assessment of the connection between property and responsibility.
Right. Now, there's another way in which responsibility is used that I feel doesn't hold to this logical train of thought. And it's when you start tying them to rights. I think you have to be very careful here. Rights often imply responsibility. And some people are under the assumption that responsibilities imply the rights. That's two ways of looking at it. The first being, if you have the right to free speech, then you have the responsibility of everything that you say. Which means if I say something and I claim it to be truth and my beliefs, then you're responsible for upholding that belief. Or if you make a deal verbally with somebody, you're still responsible for upholding the implications of that. Now, you're not responsible for the actions that other people take because of what you say, but you're responsible for what you say. You own it. You can't claim to have not said it. Well, you can, but it's not true. It's a violation of, just a basic principle of like saying, is that mine? Well, you can't give it away, The second concept of responsibilities implying rights is that it implies that only the capable should have the right to whatever it is they're doing. For instance, some people believe that if you are incapable of owning a gun and being responsible with it, like taking care of it and not just randomly shooting people with it or stuff like that.
Right, using it appropriately.
Yeah, then you shouldn't be able to have the right to own a firearm. Now, my issue with this is the same as I'd said before about, you have the right to vote. You have the right to vote so that you're responsible for it. What they really mean is you are capable of being a responsible voter, therefore we're going to give you the right to do it. It's the concept of there's this hidden implied standard that comes with each of these. And that's a problem when you get into talking about multiple people in a society that may have different standards. How do you apply a standard that is fair across all of them? And that's where I think you run into a problem with taking responsibilities first and saying, okay, how is this person responsible for whatever? If so, then give them the right. That's flawed. That's a flawed premise. In the Constitution of the United States, they talk about inalienable rights. And what that really means is there are rights that are just endowed in who you are. They can't be given, and they can't really ever be taken away, except through coercive means or ending your life.
Not taken away, but violated.
Violated, exactly. And so, if responsibilities are derived from rights, then the same is true. You can violate your rights, and thus, by impeding on your authority to be responsible over something, all in the same. It's kind of two halves of the same coin. And a lot of the times today, you also hear about responsibilities. I'm moving to my third talk about responsibilities is with certain speakers that are prominent in today's circles, they talk about how responsibilities are the source of purpose in life. The Petersons of the world talk about this a lot and saying that, people have been afforded all these rights, but they're not encouraged to take up the responsibility for those rights. And it's through those responsibilities we gain our meaning in life. And I think while that's an interesting concept to talk about, I don't know that it's based in any real axiomatic principle. I'm not sure. And it gets a little too fuzzy in the logic there. And so it's hard to say for certain whether that's true or not. Or I don't even know if we want to go down that road today, because that can end up in a lot of different places. So that's kind of my preamble in here in talking about responsibilities. And I want to walk through a couple of interesting results of this principle we've laid out, if you don't have anything else to say about starting it off.
So the only thing I have to add is one thing about focusing a lot on responsibilities and and so closely coupling them with rights sort of leads to this consequence. And I won't take credit for this idea, but basically there's an idea that when we constantly put up reminders about our responsibilities, we kind of forget about our rights. We become so hyper focused on responsibilities that we forget to actually be free, and we chain ourselves with responsibilities, thinking that they are the real goal when they aren't.
Right.
And so I think that's another thing that goes along with what you were saying about how people like the Petersons of the world, might say that responsibilities are the real purpose, and they aren't.
Right. So I think that's definitely very important. And also when we talk about responsibility, we're talking about eschewing responsibility on another person, and that gets into a weird place where it begins to question the authority of the individual to assume their responsibilities or not. If I tell you you're not being responsible, I'm imposing my judgment on you. And with responsibilities being tied so tightly to rights like that, you can really quickly move into a place where we're all trying to determine how responsible another person is, or if they're being responsible, and that's bringing an outside judgment in on those people, and quickly can lead to coercion. And that happens all the time in a state society, in a stated society, stateful, something like that society. A society,
a typical society, in which a state exists.
Yeah, exactly. The government all the time will, for instance, go so far as to take children away from their parents, because the government imposes standards that you must uphold if you're going to have children, even though the reality is you chose to have them, mostly, and they are your responsibility. And a lot of people would say that, oh, you're responsible for that, so you should oversee it as it sees fit. Now, with children, it's a slightly different circumstance, because they're other people with their own rights. And that gets into a murky circumstance where, when you're talking about children, when do they become full people? And that's a whole topic of discussion for another day. But to pick up on another example, I kind of mentioned there, is the justice system. And we had talked about that yesterday, or the last time we spoke, with our talk on free will. If holding someone to account, or holding them responsible for their actions, what gives you the right to uphold those standards of responsibility? And because we live in a state society, the state gets that authority from the people, or whatever, since it's a democracy. But when we're talking about this in the pure metaphysical sense of rights and responsibilities, you get into this weird place where the most logical seeming outcome is that each person gets to level their own response, that gets to take into account for themselves whether or not they're responsible for the things that they do. And more importantly, I think nature kind of comes into effect. Like, if you have the right to eat, if you don't feed yourself, nature will impose upon you the consequences of those responsibilities. And there are ways as well other individuals can exercise their freedoms in a way that can enforce upon you consequences of your actions by taking the responsibility for them. For instance, if I enter into a contract with you to perform labor for you, and I do a really bad job, but I barely meet the minimums of the requirement, and I find ways to circumvent the contract in ways that are malicious intent, you can take that to the public and say, this is how he worked for me. Like, you have, as long as it's within the bounds of the contract, you should still honor the contract, but you can then choose not to associate with that individual again. And I think this happened for a long time, and it still happens a lot today in matters where we don't involve the government or any kind of state. Friendships, for instance. Friendships end all the time because one person violates an expectation that the other had, and so the friendship ends. We see this actually in businesses a lot with the Yelp model. People leave reviews all the time, and it's becoming a huge part of life to just leave a bad review for something you don't like or you don't think is good and give your reasons. And so in this type of society, which kind of mimics an older society where communities were much, much smaller, we're able to kind of bring some of that connectivity back with the internet. You can see easily what other people's opinions are, and they can exert their influence, which is not necessarily coercion, I would argue, to help affect your decision and possibly impose some kind of pseudo-sanctions on a person for, I wouldn't do business with that guy. He's pretty dishonest. He cheated me. I feel as though he cheated me because he was exploiting loopholes in the contract. He violated the spirit of the agreement and acted in bad faith. Things like that. Well, those aren't crimes, and you can't punish someone because you don't have the authority to directly go in and punish someone, even though they are responsible. You can take that responsibility as evidence and make your case to the public that
you, quote unquote, punish them by going against their reputation.
Exactly. And in a reputation-based society, your accountability is everything. And your ability to be responsible in a way becomes a credit on a social credit. Now, for crimes, there comes a way where it becomes a bit more difficult. In the talk we had last time, we talked about a person who killed a person, the Captain Neckbeard or whatever. So he killed some people to try to do some good. Well, he violated the rights to be alive for those other people, and he's responsible for that. And so then we run into the conundrum of, well, the original instigator violated the non-aggression principle, which is the core principle of libertarianism, for example. But I think that's something that most people would agree with. Don't aggress against people that don't aggress against you. And if someone aggresses against you unprovoked or in any way, then they have violated your freedom. So, then they are responsible. And so then the question becomes, at that time, does the people aggressed against and the witnesses then have the authority to act against that person in a preventative way or in an isolatory way, like cut them out of society, because they're exercising their freedom from that point to put pressure on that person. However, in our current society, the standard is if you commit murder, you are forcibly taken out of society, and minimum for quite a while after being confirmed guilty, and then you up to possibly even have your life ended via capital punishment. So for me, I'm trying to think about, and I'll be honest, a lot of my research I did just about the concepts, and I really wanted to talk out the repercussions in today's podcast. What do you do with a person who has committed something like murder in the type of society we're talking about, where we know they're responsible, but we don't necessarily, does that imbue the other individuals with the authority to act against it or not? So responsibility and authority are tied together pretty strong. In a way, responsibility imbues authority. If you're responsible, in my opinion, if you are responsible for something, then you have the authority to act on it. Or if that's not the implied case, it's the only logical outcome. How could you be responsible for something and then not have the authority to enact your responsibility? I think is logically inconsequential, and in the pragmatic sense, it's useless to say you own this land and you're responsible for it, but you don't have the authority to do what you wish on it.
I think, well, maybe one exception would be, let's say you're hiring someone to look after your property. Now they are responsible for what happens to the property while not having the authority to do whatever changes they want.
Sure, but they are imbued with some authority. I actually got into it with a person on r/libertarianism about this, something similar to this, and it was the incident of the Exhale City, Vape City Screecher. That's an interesting video. But long story short, there was an employee who asks a patron to leave, or a customer to leave, and the customer wants to be served. And there's a hot debate going on about who was in the right and who was in the wrong. But one of the big discussions that we had was that the employee violated the owner's policy by asking that person to leave because of their political beliefs. Now, while some would argue that the employee does have the authority to ask people to leave because they've been delegated that authority from the owner. Well, then you really get into the nuance of, well, what authority have you exactly been given? And the argument can be made that the person you choose to take care of your land, or in the case of the Screecher, does the person you leave in charge, the employee, have they been given the authority to interpret the policy and to make exceptions, which I argued that they did not. And so by trying to violate the policy first, they were overstepping their authority, and then because they did not have that authority, they couldn't ask the person to leave, and so on and so forth. I do think you could make plenty of nuanced discussions, and I think that responsibility and authority can be divisible. You can divide responsibilities, and this happens all the time in places of employment. We divvy up whose job it is to do what all the time. And you are given enough authority to ensure that you can carry out those responsibilities but it's all delegated from the owner or the person at the top. And they can delegate that authority out and split it up as they need. You see this in events where, there are managers, and each manager can't fire people from other departments, for example. They're responsible and have authority only under people under their purview. And so while I do think you can divvy it up a little bit, ultimately, I will say there is the ultimate authority in each instance, but even in cases of delegated responsibility, if you're delegated a partial responsibility for a place, you're only delegated the partial authority for it as well. And like, for instance, property managers do this a lot. They're not in charge of building the place. They have no say over who can live there usually. That standard is set out by the owner. But then they can be given a whole overwhelming responsibility to maintain and keep it clean, keep it up to date, deal with the day-to-day stuff. And so they're given a large responsibility and a large amount of authority, but the ultimate authority is still, it goes back to where it's derived from. And interestingly, it's weird how I find myself somewhat agreeing with religious people over this, because they believe this system is the same. There's the ultimate authority, usually their deity or deities, but that authority is then delegated out from that. And even though there's a hierarchy of who gets the ultimate say, but there's usually narrowing scopes of responsibility that build up the structure, involving tens to hundreds to even thousands of people in the case of the Catholic Church, for example, where each person is divvied up responsibility. And a lot of that kind of comes from the idea of a family unit model in human beings. Oftentimes, raising a child is difficult, and so parents must work together to achieve a greater possible outcome than one could by themselves. And so oftentimes you'll see parental units, even in the anthropological sense, that they each divvied up responsibilities and were responsible for different parts of it themselves. So I don't know what you think about that. And there's a lot of concepts I kind of threw out all at once, being it, parents splitting responsibility, and then that idea of division of labor got moved up into the higher levels of society when it comes to employment. And if you look at, and anthropologically, if you look at how humans have advanced to form civilizations, it becomes obvious that working in coordination with each other, we can achieve greater things than we could by ourselves. So there does have to be some way to coordinate the workings of multiple people, and the method for doing that oftentimes is, if you come from the concept of property ownership, someone owns it, but then the responsibility and authority for the thing from the owner then is distributed out to multiple people, and then you have autonomy within that scope to work as you see fit to add to the greater of the whole. And so while responsibility is derived from property rights directly, like that's where it comes from in first principles, I believe, it's not strictly tied to it. You don't have to own part of it to be responsible for it. You can be delegated that authority. And that's one difference that you see also in things like communism. Communism, in a large way, has this weird conflicting double standard where it believes in ownership for everybody. So individual ownership is abolished, and since everybody owns everything, everyone has responsibility for everything. And so they use that vehicle while taking away the concept of individual ownership, which is why I think it's fundamentally flawed in a way. But that's getting into communism. But what I'm trying to point out is that systems of responsibility being derived from ownership show up in, I would argue, almost every different, philosophical realm, in some way, shape, or form. And the only way it logically makes sense in my head is that if you own it, you're ultimately responsible. But within that realm of responsibility comes the ability to delegate. And then people can then own responsibility in that in that sense, and then they take on that responsibility in that way. It's the main chain of transfer for people. And then same thing with transferring property. If I sell it to you, I give up all responsibility and rights and responsibilities to it. And responsibility is the vehicle by which you can take the result or use of something and claim its ownership over it as well. Because if you're responsible for something and like a crop yield and you do really well and you make more crops, then ownership in that way derives more ownership, which derives more responsibility that you can then sell, for a profit, for your own benefit. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with that. And I do want to talk a little bit more about the ways responsibilities are misinterpreted to a negative outcome, because that's where I feel like this conversation is inevitably going to lead. But do you have anything else you want to talk about as far as the principle of responsibility? If I addressed all your questions.
No, I think that addresses all that.
Right. Okay. So the ways in which I view it wrong. There is a place on the internet, a YouTube channel, that gets a lot of flack from a lot of people and is beloved by many people for different reasons. Prager University. Depending on who you are, you might think that, that's a pretty legitimate, good side of level-headed people that I believe a lot of things they believe, and it's very American. And some people are avidly against it because for other reasons. It's contentious, for sure. And while I won't discredit them and say that everything they do is wrong and bad or in bad faith, there are some things about them which some other people may like that to me make it difficult to deal with, and even I find myself rejecting some of their premises. And I think it goes back to what people fail to realize is Prager University. This is a classical conservative outlet. Not a neo-conservative, it's classical conservatism, which is authoritarianistic in its roots. That's what it is. When you hear people talk about classical conservatism, they talk about, people do things immoral, so we need to enforce it on them. Well, you're enforcing morality in that way, is what I mean by classical conservatism. People long forget before now that it wasn't too long ago that conservatives were the ones arguing for restricting free speech for things like pornography and things and profanity, which they thought were morally wrong. And so PragerU still falls in line with that. And they talk about responsibility when it comes to being a good citizen. And what's interesting to me is when they talk about responsibility, what they're really talking about is altruism and doing things that you should do based on moral principles. They're not really derived from the concept of property. And you see this a lot when it comes to talking about responsibilities in the citizenry. And the biggest one is, you're a voter, so you are responsible for your vote. While there's a point to be made there that you are given a vote, the reality is you don't own anything with that. You don't own that vote. And the reason I could say that is, can you sell that vote? Should you be able to sell that vote? Why can't I sell my vote to you, David? And then you vote twice. Why can't I do that?
Because the law says you can't.
Right. But there's a reason it says that. There's a moral underlying principle there that's being enforced. Same thing with the government. Who owns the government? I mean, in the United States, we like to say we the people. Like the government rules by consent of the people and derives its authority from people giving up that authority and taking it out of their own hands, which in reality that's not totally the case because it's a one-way transaction because of social contract theory. You were born here, you receive benefits, we've taken care of you. Now that you're able to take care of yourself, or we take care of bigger things that you couldn't take care of for yourself, so you owe us in that way, even though you never agreed to enter into that contract. And it's hard because you can't, because when you're born into it, you can't, as a fresh out of the womb child, negotiate a contract like that. Instead, your parents kind of sign you up for that, and usually in the very literal sense. I don't know about you, David, but I didn't sign up for Social Security. My parents signed me up for Social Security because they were sort of, ham-fisted into it by the government, So when you can see here that we're missing the basic principles. You don't own it. No one owns the government except the government. You own no stake. It's not like owning stock in a business. You can choose to leave that. You can choose to give it up. And I know some people say, well, if you don't like it, you can leave the country. I'm like, that's true. But there are no alternatives.
Right. Everywhere you could choose to go otherwise has its own governing, we'll call them authority, who will coerce you if you don't want to play their game too.
Right. And they all demand subjugation in some way or shape or form. And in the United States, I feel like that subjugation is played off as responsibility. It's a huge factor of it. People will say, you need to, you're choosing to vote for a person or not. So whenever you vote for somebody, if they get into office and do a bad thing, you're partially responsible. And if you don't vote, you're still responsible because you didn't exercise your voice. When in reality, it's like, that's not how that works. You can't force a choice on me and then assign me the responsibility either way, because it's forced from the beginning. However, this is not viewed as being a bad thing, because another big component of classical conservatism is religious morality, freedom and morality. So because they're used to it in the concept of a church, where you're responsible, but some other entity can take that responsibility away from you. Like, you are helpless, you're a bad person. You can't take care of yourself. So something else does, and then you owe that person that allegiance, even though you never got the chance to try. It's interesting to see how that, in the context of a church, can easily be applied to a government, and it's almost the same structure. And some argue that that's exactly what the Founding Fathers intended for this country, is we were founded on the Judeo-Christian values, and because of that, we're taking that similar relationship and making it into a government because it just worked for so well for so long that way. Why wouldn't we do it the other way, But the core principle when it comes to responsibility is you're not responsible for the government, and apparently the government's not responsible for itself either, because no one owns it, and that's a problem. The reason the same problems don't crop up in things like businesses is because there's an owner. There is someone out there whose name is on the lease or on the title that the buck stops. When we elect a president, we're not giving him ownership of the government. We don't divvy up the ownership of the government amongst the senators and the leaders either. It's almost as though the ownership goes all the way back to the Founding Fathers in a way, because they're the ones who started it. They set out the original, rules in the Constitution. And so all of the things that come out of the government, all the authority it claims to have, has got to be coming from somewhere other than ownership, and they take it over their citizens. So when people tell you that the government doesn't own their citizenry, but they're responsible for them, that's where I take issue. You really can't separate the two. You're either owned by your government in some way, or you're not. If you are, then they can claim authority over you and be responsible for you, which the government does do. You can't separate the two, I would argue, and maintain logical consistency. And that is really the core gripe that anarchists have with government, is that they took ownership wrongfully and are exercising authority and responsibility even by choice, without the choice and consent of the people, like without even owning it. You see what I'm saying?
Right, and we can take people, the ownership of people, out of the picture and think about another concept, the government ownership of land.
Right.
How the government claims authority over some territory. So, let's imagine a hypothetical situation. Joe, you and I are on a desert island that we washed up on. And I see, over the or near the horizon, I see some hills, and I say, Joe, I own the hills, and you say, well, why? Well, because I own them, and because if you try to use them, then I'm going to beat you up. That, but you're not using the hills. I don't care.
Right. Well, and that actually goes back to John Locke talked about that, and he gets championed a lot of times as one of the original libertarians. But when you really read into what he has to say about it, it's not so much. He's more of what would be considered a conservative today. Because he had that same idea of, claiming land that's unclaimed. You can claim it. If it doesn't belong to anybody, then you can claim it as your own ownership. And then you can keep it, so long as you cultivate it. You have to be responsible for it and do the good thing to it. What God would want you to do, or it's the responsibility of others to then come in and take it from you to make it worth something. That's something he advocated, which we would balk at today because it doesn't matter if I own that land. I could set up a huge dumpster fire and keep it perpetually running on that land. If that's my choice, it should be my choice. If I'm not hurting anybody else, say I put air scrubbers to get all the toxic smoke out. Nothing leaves my property. It's all within my right. But yeah, I mean, the United States government anyway, owns huge swaths of land, especially when you start looking out west, when they stop just giving it away, which you could argue that it wasn't even theirs to give away, but when it comes to just giving something away, it's less of a transaction,
Well, right. Well, and you particularly see this now the federal government doesn't really do this, but state governments especially do, or at least counties, they would say that you don't even actually own your private property. The local government does, and that's why you have to pay taxes. You're basically renting it from the government.
Right, and then further proof for that is the exercising of eminent domain. The government can force you off your property. Now, they have to pay you, but it doesn't matter.
You can't really negotiate the price anyway.
You can't negotiate the price, and I can't tell you no. I can't tell them no. If they want to build a public utility, a power line or a road through your property for any reason, they can do that. They'll have to compensate you for the land, but that's no different than the landlord kicking you out of your apartment and giving you your security deposit back, in a lot of ways. So do you really own it? And this really starts highlighting the main problem. There is no way for our government to exist and exercise authority without having ownership. That's the fundamental flaw that makes all governments different. That's what sets it apart from other institutions, and also its monopoly on power, monopoly on power and force. Now, a long time ago, people saw this model, and it was just kind of the natural occurrence. Human history is violent. Human beings are violent. We exercise power and authority over other people since the dawn of time. And a lot of it came from the sense that we were primitive animals. We're no different than any other animal. And, there are alpha males since the beginning of time that, because of their size and capability, would exercise it over others. And then that evolved into things like monarchies, which we look on now as being archaic and terrible, but that's only the natural progression. The thing about democracy is the democracy is not much better, because now there's no one that owns it. So it's just this amoeba of nothingness that for some reason everyone gives authority. But it's not that they really give it authority, it's that it takes it with the power it exercises. In reality, the government collects taxes because it makes you pay them, not because you willingly give them up. It's all still operated via the same tools of coercion. I would argue, though, that a democracy is a step in the right direction, even if it leads you closer to more dangerous territory. Because instead of having a single individual who owns everything and has pure authority over everyone, now there are a handful of people that have authority. Because in reality, that's kind of how it is. In the Congress, and between the Congress, the President, and the judges on the Supreme Court, each of them hold a piece of authority that they can combine via voting in the House of Congress, for example, or voting to approve or deny on the Supreme Court, or in the case of the presidency, just exercise to actually make things happen and exercise that authority, even if it's wrongly derived, by using that power. But still, it's moving closer, because in an ideal world, I would argue that each person would have all of the authority over themselves. So now, instead of having one person, it's more people having authority. Now, there are some dangers with this, because they can be held to some degree of responsibility. I've been told, they have to derive their authority because they can be voted out. The populace can exercise their power, vote to put people they want in. So there is more accountability there. They are more responsible to their base, than before. But still, once they get there, they're given free. It's weird. It's like an analogy of the property manager. They're given only in the way that you had said it. Like, I give the property manager all the authority to do anything that they want for 4 years, or 6 years or 2 years, and which is weird. You can't remove them once they're up there, and you can fire them afterwards, but there's a time limit, which is weird. I think a good step from here would be abolish term limits and abolish voting cycles. Just whenever enough people get together and cast a vote to remove you, you're just out then. And then, essentially what it would be is the people could just, if I get a majority of the people together to put another person there, then I just put another person there. And it's a lot more quick and reactionary. But as I was saying earlier, this puts you a lot closer to another huge problem. The authority is not being redistributed evenly. It's being given to everyone, a little piece to everybody. The problem is, does the authority I own extend beyond myself, or is it just for myself, or is it to another person? When I cast my vote, I'm voting to implement a change that's going to go out to everybody, and rule over everybody. So whenever we vote for a policy like raising taxes, it's not just me who's affected, it's everybody.
Right, that's the thing, is that you're not just exercising authority for yourself, you are imposing your will on everybody else.
Yeah, it's almost like a two-sided problem. There's the problem of who gets the authority, or exercising authority over others, and then there's the problem of deriving that authority directly to the individual. It gets lost, because it would be one thing, in the ideal world, the ratio would be 1-to-1. I have all of the things I have, and then my responsibility is exactly in proportion to that. Where in reality, and this is something that both sides of the political spectrum even agree with to a point, but then they disagree on how to solve the problem. For instance, you hear a lot of Democrats appealing to people saying, who realistically own nothing and are responsible for nothing in the practical sense. Like, if you don't own anything and you are having to be taken care of, then why should you get a vote? But they're arguing that people have more than they should have, so we should take it from them by a vote. And then the other side has the same problem, where there are fewer people, but they control so much more and are responsible for so much more, but they have the exact same problem. The ratios are skewed depending on where you lie on the socioeconomic scale. The amount for which you're responsible is either greater or lesser than the amount of authority you're given to exercise sweeping change for everybody. And don't get me wrong, it would be wrong if a person who had who owned a bunch of land and a bunch of stuff and had a bunch of control over a business to get more votes than the person who didn't have any, because it's still exercising that authority for both of them. So it's a dual problem, I think.
Right. The problem isn't the proportion of societal authority, or like the ratio of societal authority to property. It's that the scope of their societal authority goes greater than their own sphere, their own property, basically.
Yeah.
That it's not that it's unfair that someone who's rich and someone who's poor have the same authority over the government. It's that both of them claim to have authority over other people.
Exactly. So there's the logical problem from the first principles, and then there are all these other problems that arise from that first problem not being solved, and people trying to address it in ways that, it's like having cancer and trying to do everything to make your life better except cure the cancer. And I think the reason it's never getting addressed is because there's the people who are put in place to change it. They have to fight the temptation of, I've gotten more than I've earned. You know, I've got power that I don't have to be responsible for. And that's a hard thing to give up. And they use tools all the time to push down against the people who should have authority over themselves. And calling out responsibilities is the biggest one. You know, you're responsible to help your fellow man. Why? Why? You know, you're responsible for taxes. Why? You benefit from those things.
But I didn't ask for it.
But I didn't ask for it. And that's another thing you see mix up all the time. People say you should be responsible from things that you benefit from. And people love to focus on that, but that's not true. That's only half of it. You should also be responsible for everything that doesn't go your way that you own.
It's like, well, I mean, you know, the classic illustration I like to use. If I show up to your house and start a garden out front just because I want to, and I you know, do all the landscaping myself and set up a garden and say, look, Joe, I made this garden for you. Pay up.
Yeah, you're forcing me into a contract that I shouldn't have to uphold.
But Joe, you're benefiting from it. You owe me.
Exactly. It doesn't matter. You know, like I didn't want that thing, and that's the ultimate problem. And there's no way, in my opinion, to solve it where a government exists or where anyone is able to exercise any authority over another person in a coercive manner. You know, because you can have authority exercised over you appropriately by giving up that authority or giving a person the right to have some authority over you. You do it all the time when you enter a job. But the point is you were consciously able to get that job. Like we have child labor laws here. You can't go get a job when you're 4 and then give up some of your control to your employer because that's not how that works. We don't think you have the capability to make that decision effectively. Yet we do the same thing with the government. They take children and give them citizenship. Like, you are a citizen now. It's like, what if I don't want to be? You know, what happens? And I hate that there are some people out there that they start here and they end up in the sovereign citizen camp where, oh, well, I don't know anything to anybody. They have a point. You know, they do. And it's just cringeworthy all the time to see it, though, because people love to poke fun at it, like thinking, oh, you're above the law. And it's like, no, the principle they're coming from is correct, but they're trying to live in a system that isn't reality. And then that's where they run into the pragmatic wall.
Well, the other thing that makes them particularly cringeworthy is that they then like try to invoke the letter of the law to support their antics.
Right.
I'll call them. You know, they'll go and do something illegal and then say, well, but this law. Well, I thought you didn't have an agreement with the government. I thought you didn't acknowledge their laws as legitimate. What do you mean?
Right. And that's the ultimate method of coercion by the government, too. It's like, well, what happens if I'm not a citizen? Oh, well, then you don't have rights. Like the government can take them away from you. And that's another thing that I really get pissed about is people talking about, like with the illegal immigrant thing right now. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a pragmatic argument to be made about that right now. But when you start invoking things like, well, they don't have rights like citizens do. Why not? Did the government give them the rights? No. Read the damn Bill of Rights. It says, we find these rights to be self-evident, which means the government didn't give them to you.
That's not in the Bill of Rights, by the way.
Oh, it's not in the Bill of Rights?
That's in the Declaration of Independence.
Oh.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Okay,
all men are created equal.
That's right. Sorry. Well, the Declaration of Independence says it, and I forget, there is a clause coming from the Second Amendment that talks about...
the Second Amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Right. I'll look it up. I know it's in the Bill of Rights somewhere, but I forget the exact verbiage. But there's a small piece that talks about how you have these rights. Oh yeah, it's the shall not be infringed.
Oh, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Right, and
it doesn't declare that people have a right to keep and bear arms. It acknowledges it. Right,
but that's the point. It acknowledges you have this right. If the government can't infringe on it, it means the government didn't give it to you in a logical sense. It's not like the government in the past said, oh, we're going to give them this right and then no one else can take it away. Because that's not the point. There's logical inconsistencies there. If you look at it in the whole, and I'll find some more evidence for this, I promise. I know that I'm kind of going off a wheel here, But a lot of the Enlightenment thinking was you just have these rights given by God or whomever, their creator, whatever. You have them. And the Bill of Rights is telling the government not to give the people this. It's do not try to take these things away. It will go badly, because that's how we got here, So is it that people that just so happen to be born in America were given these rights by their creator? Or is it everybody? And the government loves to get wishy-washy on this because they love to push around people who aren't their citizens. They have to not push around their citizens because of convenience, because trying to rule a democracy by fiat can get difficult when even a quarter of the population starts throwing a fit. Look at the Vietnam era. People did not want to be in Vietnam. It didn't matter how much power the government could exercise to do what it wanted. If enough people don't want it, it will not happen, But even the government doesn't give you the rights that you own, or you have. You're born with them. And that's what I like about the libertarian argument from first principles, is that it's the only thing that makes logical sense, that can function this way. That they're imbued in you because you're an agent of free will or whatever. You're an individual and you have these things. And so I hate when people say, well, the government gives you all this stuff and you should pay it back. It's like, well, no, the government forces this on me. And people like to, boo-hoo about, oh, you're forced to have roads and you're forced to have, clean air and all this stuff. And it's like,
of course, this is cherry picking, of course.
Sure, it's cherry picking. Well, you're also forced to have defense, and you're forced to have taxes. It can all be cherry picked either way. But that's the point, is all of it's wrong because all of it's force. And what's even more egregious is that I can call the government responsible, but who is that? There's no individual that owns it. If I have a problem because something happens to me, like a bulldozer crams onto my land and tears up my yard and bulldozes my house, there is a person who is responsible. One person.
The driver of the bulldozer.
Mm-hmm. And he can forward that responsibility up to the person who's told him to do it. But whatever. There's an individual where the buck will eventually stop. With the way a democracy works, there's no individual where the buck stops. It's spread out. The responsibility is spread out. And that's a problem because, and we also have this, the concept of a representative. So let's say, I vote for somebody to represent me in Congress, and then they vote to do something that basically everyone agrees is a bad idea. Let's say they declare war on some country and then go do a whole bunch of damage and commit atrocities in war and things like that. Now, can someone trace that responsibility all the way back to me and say, aha, you voted for this person who voted to declare war. You're responsible for the war. No. I voted for them because of something else, or, whatever. I didn't, in this hypothetical case, I didn't want the war. Right.
So how can you hold me responsible for it? I didn't tell anyone to go fight.
Well, that's the other problem too, is according to the Constitution the founding documents. I'm not going to say one or the other because I don't want to get in trouble again for not being precise enough. The government derives its right to rule from the people. All people. So essentially, everyone who consents to allow the government to keep functioning is responsible. Even if you voted against it, you're still responsible because you pay the taxes to fund it. You don't actively fight against it. You are within its system. Every American is responsible for everything that the government does, whether you like it or not. And that responsibility is being forced on us by...
I was going to say, is that really fair, though? Because
it's not.
For all intents and purposes, paying taxes is not optional.
Right. But that's...
Technically, it is optional, but not really.
Exactly. It's all coercion, though. And that's... But when I said it's...
Right. So can you say, okay, I'm gonna make up another hypothetical situation. Okay, let's say you're carrying cash. Somebody robs you on the street, steals your money, uses that money to buy ingredients to build a bomb, and then goes and kills a bunch of people. Are you responsible for the murders?
No.
Right.
But according to the logic laid out by the founding documents of our own country, yes.
Yep.
That's the problem, is that responsibility is being artificially enforced on people, when it's not true responsibility, but it's getting called that. And it's getting enforced as though it is, And that's the main problem, is it's this responsibility isn't responsibility. When they say you're responsible for the outcome of the election, you're responsible for what that person does or not if you didn't vote. It's whatever. No, you're not. You can't be. And the reason this imbalance in responsibility exists is because there's an artificial imbalance in authority. And the reason there's an artificial imbalance in authority is because there is an entity that has no individual that owns anything. And there's no hierarchical structure for who owns what either. We don't all collectively own the vast spots of government land that's just out there in Nevada. If so, I could go and claim, hey, I want a piece. I want my piece of that government land to live on. Where is it? They can't tell you because it isn't yours. You don't have the right for it. So then I don't own it. So then I'm not a part of it. But it's all being enforced as though it is through coercion and power and fiat, And that's my biggest gripe, is that responsibility comes from ownership. And right now, there's collective ownership. That's what it is. For all the people that say they hate communism because it's collective ownership, well, spoiler alert, you live in a limited collective ownership society. Every piece of government land is collectively owned. Everything the government owns is collectively owned. Everything the government does is collectively responsible to the people.
This goes beyond the government as well. Corporations are collectively owned.
That's right. And we prop up artificial institutions that are collectively owned. If you are sold something by the Bayer Corporation, like a aspirin that just happens to be poisonous and almost kills you, when you sue that, no one at Bayer is going to jail. They just have to pay you.
No, the corporation will pay you money.
Yes. And that's the problem.
Or will pay your family money if it kills you.
Right. And the thing is, don't get me wrong, they can be held responsible in that monetary way, but really, you can't point a finger at anybody, in particular, for being at fault.
Right. Because we're casting blame, we're casting responsibility and therefore blame on some concoction of our minds.
Right. I'm going to put forth one final example because we're running low on time. I get arrested for committing a crime. It's claimed to me that I murdered a whole family of people, 4 people, a wife, a husband, 2 kids. I didn't do this. I know I didn't do this, but it doesn't matter. I'm found guilty by by the will of the people in the form of the court and my peers. I am then executed, and then the day after my execution, the real killer confesses, and he has all the evidence to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he did it. Who is responsible for my death? Now, who? Everybody. Under the system we've laid out, right? In a little way. Well, the normal crime for killing a person, we have a crime for that. We have expectations for what should be done about that. 30 years in prison, say, 35 years. Or in this case, say I was levied with that crime of, a life sentence in prison. Okay? So let's just divide that. Let's just say we be logical for a second. How do you divvy that responsibility up amongst everybody? What is one lifetime divided by the sum total of the population of the United States equal? But you can't have it like that. How does one life sentence divide out to that many people? Well, you can argue that, a lifetime is forever. So technically, forever divided by any number is forever. So you all should now go serve.
Yep, let's just put the entire
country in jail.
Yep.
Including the people who run the jails.
Mm-hmm.
We're in jail to each other. But in a weird way, that's kind of how it is. You can't. It doesn't work. And that's the problem. Well, that's an obvious another symptom of the problem.
That would be an interesting conclusion. If things like that could happen, people would suddenly care a lot more about whether false convictions happened.
Right. And they really would, because what if you're wrong? And not only that, but every person the government kills by accident or kills in a war, there's a tribal element as well as, we don't care what happened. How many people really cared about all of the combatants in Iraq and Afghanistan? I didn't know those people. and so I'm inclined to care less. But in reality, and some of them were bad people that we would have wanted killed, and we all are happy about it.
Well, yeah, there is this tribalistic mentality of the enemy,
Yeah.
right? And so, and it's an enemy to such a degree that we basically dehumanize them. They're not people; they're enemies.
Right. And it's weird that I'm at this point, because a lot of these terror groups and terror cells, they claim America is responsible. And I remembered hearing people say, well, it's not the people, it's the government. But they're the same people that will say, well, the government rules by consent of the people, so they need our say. So, no, it can't be both. Either the government is a separate entity that does have the authority and does own everything, or we own it all and we share the collective responsibility, which I strongly disagree with, because how can you collectively really own anything? You can't divvy out responsibility like that. Responsibility is on a one-to-one parity. You're either responsible or you're not, or you can be partially responsible through a delegated authority chain, but this is not delegated. No one has consented to say, well, I'll be partially responsible for the actions of this group, because we don't get that choice. It's all coerced. And that's my big problem with the way responsibility gets used today and where it actually comes from, and the disparity between the common usage and understanding of how rights and responsibilities come from, and where I believe it comes from first principles. In short, people believe that the government gives you the right to do things, or the freedom from things. And since they give you those things, they're responsible for you. And since they're responsible for you, they own you. Or even the other way. Well, the whole of the people own the government. Well, then that's not an agreement anyone really agreed to, and you can't back out of. So you're being coerced either way. Either side of the coin you're looking at it. And it's because it violates that first principle. It's like trying to do math, in grammar, with grammar language rules. It's not the same. And so it doesn't work. And that's fundamentally why a lot of libertarians are they're anti-statist. They are anarchists in some ways. And really the only varying degree comes from pragmatic ways. But I would argue that when you start trying to enforce pragmatic rules on something as so core to the principle of first principles, which is responsibility coming from ownership, it gets really difficult to start. If you break it down that early, everything that comes out of that is going to be even farther from the ideal. And while I'm not going to argue that the ideal is the only way to proceed forward, it's something that we should constantly be striving towards. And instead of addressing the issues of, well, what is the government doing with its power, we should really be talking about why they even have it in the first place and where it's coming from, and solving that problem and reducing it. So that's kind of my sum up of the spiel. David, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to the end of it.
I think that's a good place to leave it, and I think we're about ready to move along toward our goal of talking about justice next.
Justice.
Yes. So once we identify responsibilities, now we can start talking about what happens when they are foregone.
I agree. And I'm really looking forward to that one a lot. I think So, well, with that, Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.